Hey, Jeff and Cole here from the Tryhard Academy podcast, letting you know that this episode is brought to you by Rogue Knights Gaming, located in Kaiser, Oregon.
Come play with us in one of our three family-friendly seating areas, and while you're here, load up your arsenal with the latest and greatest Magic the Gathering singles, D&D products, board games, and much more.
So come on in. Plenty of tables, plenty of space, and a selection of cards that are only surpassed by their down-home family customer service. Rogue Knights Gaming.
Heroes wanted.
Apply within. Welcome on in to another episode of the Tryhard Academy podcast, where it's always better to get good rather than get wrecked. I'm Jeff, and it's a pleasure to have you along for the ride. Cole is on vacation, so we're riding solo for this episode. On a recent episode of the Tryhard Academy podcast, you may have heard Cole and I talk about the future of the reserve list in our episode entitled Intuition. And in that episode, we discussed our opinion on the future of it, and we primarily focused on the idea that the future would take place in the form of functional reprints. In this episode, however, I'm going to be taking that topic into a different direction, and that direction is in a more practical everyday application. In this case, I'm talking about insurance, and more specifically, I'm talking about collector's insurance. Now, the first question you may be asking yourself is why? As in, why should I care, or why does this even matter to me? After all, it is just cardboard. And you'd be right to mention that. At the end of the day, it is just cardboard. It's cardboard that displays artful images and text. But here's a better question. Why not? As in, why not protect your investment? After all, you did spend your hard-earned money on a collection of cards to beat your opponents to death with, and those cards can be fairly expensive. Soldiers on a battlefield still have to maintain their equipment, and that concept applies here too. It is no different. At this point, you're probably also sitting there wondering, well, why the hell would these guys be looking at their cards as an investment? Well, that's because we do see them as investments, both in terms of playing them at tournaments, where physically having the card is a requirement for playing it, and in the context of American business law, where it has practical applications and its applications do apply. As I'd mentioned earlier in our podcast entitled Intuition, we had listed that the two main reasons why we felt that the reserve list wasn't going anywhere were promissory estoppel and the Deceptive Trade Practices Act of 1973 in Texas. These two legal concepts prevent the reserve list from ever being abolished, and nearly every U.S. state, not counting U.S. federal law, has some sort of law on the books that prevents companies from taking advantage of people in this respect. Frankly, Wizards of the Coast would suffer an immense amount of PR damage if that ever did happen, but that's beside the point. The reality of American law as it relates to Magic the Gathering is that Magic is a collectible trading card game, and that collector's items, or items that could be construed as having some sort of collectible value, are indeed valuable. More directly, the cards that are on the reserve list are seen as valuable to both investors in Magic and to Magic players as a whole, that they genuinely have a monetary value, and that monetary value can accrue over time depending on a card's rarity and scarcity. Why else do you think desperate Magic nerds steal from other Magic nerds? Hell, you've probably heard of horror stories where someone's pet dog ripped up their binders while they're out at work, or of a group of Magic nerds hanging out at a friend's house and someone spilling an energy drink on another person's cards. Things like that can and do happen. Chances are you've probably also heard of horror stories happening at some LGSs where people have broken into stores and stolen cards from that business. Businesses have liability insurance for that reason. Again, things like that can and do happen. You may have even heard of stories on social media where One day, for some oddball reason, some hook-nosed douche nozzle at an LGS decides to break into somebody else's car and steal their backpack containing their magic decks. Once again, things like that can and do happen. And finally, you may have even recently heard in the news that a sizable portion of the entire West Coast was on fire during the first couple weeks of September of 2020. Yeah, life happens on life's terms, and we can't always control what can and does happen. Now, with collector's insurance, there is no legal requirement to have it. It's not like car insurance where you need it to be able to legally drive. But if you want to be able to protect your collection and your decks for their full value, then you're going to want collector's insurance for your collectibles. One of the primary agreed upon definitions for the word expropriate, according to the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary, is to transfer the property of another to one's own possession. And since you did that when you bought your staples, it only makes sense to ensure that your collection isn't compromised. So what is collector's insurance? Just like it sounds, it's insurance for your collection, regardless of the nature of your collection. You may have even heard about it referred to as a standalone personal inland marine policy, even though that name is a bit of a misnomer in the context of what I'm talking about here. Just like getting insurance for your car, your house, or any other private property that you may have, collector's insurance is meant to be there as a failsafe against something happening to your collection, regardless of the issue. Assuming that your loss was accidental, depending on your policy, you will be reimbursed for your loss. Life happens, and insurance companies do understand that. That's why you get covered in the first place. Having it helps protect your collectibles in the same way your homeowner's insurance protects your home, or how renter's insurance protects your stuff if you're renting an apartment. But just like owning a home, your investment can accrue in value. That's why, before insuring your collection or even thinking about finding a reputable company, you're going to want an appraisal for your collection. And that's where finding an appraiser or finding a smartphone application that can roughly track and appraise your collection will become important. With those basics out of the way, we can now talk about the step-by-step process that I've personally used to help ensure and protect my personal collection. But before we start anything officially, we're going to want to find out what's actually on the RL, so that way we don't waste time on the less important cards. Card values do fluctuate from time to time, but since the cards we're interested in protecting are our reserve list cards, those cards, by definition, are cards that we know will never be reprinted again, and so they're relatively safe from devaluation, barring severe external market forces. So with that said, let's start off at step 0, finding out what's actually on the RL. Yes, finding out what's actually on the reserved list is a step 0 thing for reasons I'll touch on in just a bit. But luckily, finding out what's actually on the RL isn't that hard. That's actually the easy part. Just type in MTG reserved list into your search bar online, and you'll literally find within the first couple search entries the official reprint policy for Magic the Gathering. I'll add that into the link of the video and into the description section of the YouTube video. Now for the more important part, the reasons related to why you want to know what's on the RL. There are two reasons why it's important to know which cards are on the RL and which ones are not for the purposes of insuring your collection. The first deals with card sentimentality, and the other deals with a given insurance company's lack of familiarity with the game itself, especially as it relates to the reserve list. First, let's touch briefly on card sentimentality, as that's an easier topic to get out of the way. While you, the player, may think a particular card is tremendously valuable because of its sentimental worth to you, there is a chance that it may not be considered financially valuable according to an appraiser or an insurance provider. Cards on the RL are guaranteed to never be reprinted in any form, with the exception of functional reprints such as with the Shocklands. And so for that reason alone, it's important to sort out what you want appraised and insured from the rest of your collection. Second, let's touch on insurance companies and their level of familiarity. While Magic the Gathering has been around for 25 plus years, some insurance companies may not even be familiar with the value of your collection due to their unfamiliarity with Magic the Gathering as a collectible trading card game, much less be familiar with the reserve list itself. You cannot expect a given insurance company to be familiar with it, even if they say they are familiar with it. This is because appraisals for trading cards, and for that matter, cards within the scope and realm of a TCG, are not that common. They are, in fact, a niche market. These two reasons are why it's important to know which cards are on the reserve list and which ones are not. It's important to know which ones are on the RL so that way you know which cards are important enough to potentially insure and which ones you don't have to worry about. This also helps to explain the financial viability of your collection as an asset to your potential insurance company, so that way you can justify the payout of your collection in case something should happen to your cards down the line. The last thing you want is to get taken to the cleaners. So you have an idea of what's on the RL and you have an idea of what you want to insure. Well, where do we go from here? Let's move on to step one of this process. The next step is to find either a collection tracking application or to find a professional appraiser. And which one you choose will depend on whether or not you have the time or the money for one or the other. Secondary to whether or not you have the time or the money for that, the approximate value of your collection is also a determining factor, but I'll get into that aspect in just a bit. If you enjoy collecting and tracking your cards and have the time to spare, then a smart device application is probably ideal for you. The nice thing too is that there's a fair number of them out there, whether on the Google Play Store or on the Apple Store online. A few examples include Delver Lens, the TCG Player app, Top Decked MTG, Manabox MTG, and many others else out there. If you're like myself or Cole, however, you don't often have the time or the energy to do it yourself because of your daily life commitments. If that's the case with you, and you're the kind of person that's uber lazy and eats cereal for dinner, then getting an appraiser is probably an option to consider depending in part on your income bracket. There's a couple of ways of finding an appraiser. The first and probably most obvious way to find an appraiser is to start by asking your LGS how they inventory and insure their product. Chances are, if you're in good with the owners of your LGS, they'll probably help you out with contact info and the like. You might even get a discount if you mention who referred you, depending on the company. Another way to get the job done, though, is through an actual appraisal company that's geared towards giving appraisals for rare collectibles. This is where things get a little bit tricky since Magic the Gathering is a TCG, and most TCGs are considered a niche market. Luckily, there is a company that exclusively specializes in appraisals for MTG collections, and that company is Vintage Magic LLC based out of Olympia, Washington. I'll leave their website info in the video's description in case you're interested in contacting them, but be advised that they do charge a respectable fee for their services based on the size of your collection. You can reasonably expect to pay anywhere between $100 and $200 per hour to have your collection professionally appraised. And, depending on the size of your collection, that process may take a day or two to fully complete. If you have both the time and the money to spare, then Echo MTG is an alternative option to consider. They do charge a nominal monthly fee, but they're able to digitally track several thousands of cards based on what you pay for in their monthly subscription fee. Alternatively, Card Hoarder is another option to potentially consider. Another key factor to consider when it comes to insuring your cards is a decision on your part, the player, as to whether or not you will be playing with any of these cards in the near to immediate future. If the answer is yes, then that will play a factor in not only the overall condition of the cards that you want to insure, but also in your decision to potentially have your cards graded as well. More importantly, some insurance companies do not write policies for the cards that are still being shuffled and used, so take that into consideration when choosing a company. But if the answer is no, then there's little to worry about in these respects. Another factor to consider is the actual viability of the card's value in question. A good general rule to go by is to ask yourself this: is the card in question, historically speaking, over the last 5 to 10 years at least, considered to be a legacy format or a vintage format staple? If the answer is yes and it's on the RL, then it's probably worth insuring. If the answer is no, however, then it still may be worth your time to do a quick price check on the card, because there's always an exception to the rule. A great example of this is Juzam Jin from Arabian Nights, and if you check a site like MTG Stocks, you'll see that this card has had an upward trajectory over the last few years, historically speaking. At this point, you've probably decided on which cards you want to insure, and you've decided also on a method of assessing your cards, whether through a smartphone app, a professional appraiser, or some other method. So, where do we go from here? Well, that kind of depends on the total value of your collection, just like it was mentioned earlier in step 1. Chances are, from a practical everyday standpoint at least, that you're probably not holding on to several hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of reserved list cards, like an actual established business. But if we're being fair about things, you probably also don't have several thousands of dollars on hand either to replace everything you've lost in case something should happen. So here's a general guideline that I use for deciding on where to go from here. If the value of your collection at fair market value, whether at TCG mid or at TCG market, is greater than the cost of buying a new car fresh off the lot, and you don't have the money to pay cash for that car out the door, then chances are you should probably look at getting them insured, especially if you don't plan on playing with the actual physical copies anymore. To put it more directly, in my opinion, if your collection is valued at over $10,000, based both on TCG Mid and TCG Market, and you don't expect to play with the actual copies anymore, then getting them professionally appraised and insured is probably a solid idea. If you still do plan on using your cards in live tournaments, it may be worth your while to still look into protecting your investment, though. If you've determined that the value of your collection requires and demands that you insure your collection in order to protect it, then this is where you will want to have your collection officially appraised. For this, we'll probably want to get an official appraisal letter first. To accomplish this, we'll need to go through a company like Vintage Magic LLC, as I'd mentioned earlier. Prior to setting up your appointment with Vintage Magic, it's also a good idea to manually type up your entire reserve list collection in a spreadsheet program like Excel or Google Spreadsheets. This is a fairly handy way to keep track of all of your vital staples and allows you to continually track and add to your collection. From here, you'll then want to review your current insurance policy, whether it's your renter's policy or your homeowner's policy, if you have one. In your policy, you can determine the value of your coverage either under the non-household items section or under the collectibles hobby portion of your policy. Bear in mind, however, that some insurance carriers, including your own, may not insure collectibles, and that will require you to go to another insurance carrier for a separate standalone policy. Nonetheless, many insurance carriers will allow you to attach a rider policy onto your primary insurance policy. It's important to note, however, that their coverage limit may not be sufficient enough to cover all of your cards in the event of an accidental loss, and that too may require you to still seek out a standalone policy. If that's the case, you'll want to seek out companies that offer a standalone personal inland marine policy specifically for your collectibles. Regardless of how you are insuring your collection, to be able to process a claim with most insurance carriers, you will have to prove what you had and what it was worth. That means that in terms of listing your collection, you'll want to write down what each of your cards are, including the date purchased for each of your cards, if known, the amount paid for each card, again, if known, and any other important details related to each of the cards. While you're at it, save your receipts for your purchases if you can, as those will also help establish proof of ownership. And finally, as I said before, it's a great idea to physically type up your entire reserve list collection into a spreadsheet program like Excel or Google Spreadsheets. Doing this will make your life infinitely easier. Once all of that's done, you'll then want to take still photos of every piece and then store and or keep them in a secure location, such as a fire safe or a safety deposit box. When you purchase new cards for your collection, make sure to keep the receipts for any new additions to the collection and get documentation for any prior appraisals that you may have received. If you have any records or tableau sheets that show values for the types of items you collect, keep those handy to be able to back up your claim. As for what questions to expect from an insurance agent when you choose to call around, there are some questions that you should be prepared to answer. Here are some of them. Is there an alarm present at your residence? If so, what kind of alarm system do you have in place? If you're a renter, do you already have a renter's insurance policy for your stuff? You should have a renter's policy if you don't already have one. Are your collectibles vaulted either at a safety deposit box or something similar? And no, having a home safe doesn't exactly count for this question. What kind of residence do you live in? Is it a stick-built house, a manufactured home, a condo, something else? Have you inventoried your collection, and if so, how? Have you filed for bankruptcy in the last 5 to 10 years? Have you ever been convicted of a felony? Do you transport your collection, or do you intend on transporting your collection? What's the approximate value of your collection? Have you had any insurance claims filed in the last couple of years, usually within the last 3 to 5 years, for any reason regardless of the type of insurance claim? And for your trading cards especially, do you plan on still playing with them? A point to consider regarding the possession of a home security system alarm at your residence. Depending on what company you go through, having an alarm system, or for that matter not having one, can affect your premium depending on which company you're with, and it could vary your premium greatly. It could also affect whether or not you're even eligible for insurance with a given company. Make sure to talk to your insurance carrier to see if that's applicable to you. When comparing insurance policies, make sure that they cover a wide range of losses, such as fire, theft, damage or breakage, and any other losses through the mail. Some policies only cover losses in your home, So if you're looking to attend a GP or a Command Fest with your reserve list collection, or otherwise travel with your collection on vacation, make sure your policy covers you wherever you are, no matter where you go. It's also important to note that some policies will only cover you when you're in the United States and its territories or in the home country that you live in, so keep that in mind when choosing an insurance carrier. Oh boy, that last part was a doozy. That was quite a bit of footwork to get your collection legitimately appraised and insured. Thankfully so, there is an alternative to that if you want to keep everything in-house. Speaking of insurance, safes, and vaults and keeping your things safe, let's touch on another alternative to keeping your stuff at home if you don't want to do that. For this, we're going to keep everything in-house, quote unquote, as it were. Another alternative to getting a professional appraisal letter through an actual appraisal company and going to an actual insurance carrier for coverage is going through a vaulting and auction company that offers an appraisal service like PWCC Marketplace. Speaking of which, let's touch on them briefly now. PWCC Marketplace, located in Tigard, Oregon, is perhaps one of the better known places to professionally vault your collection outside of using an FDIC insured bank or an NCUA insured credit union. You may not know of them offhand if you're not a professional speculator or collector. However, they're generally best known for both acting as a vaulting establishment and for acting as an intermediary for trading card auctions. Their presence in the collectibles community is generally geared towards sports-oriented trading cards for basketball, American football, and many other types of professional sports, but they are also involved in other trading card environments as well. As for requesting a written appraisal for your items, you can request this service by emailing the customer service department, which will be provided in the description section of the YouTube video and in the description section for the podcast on the Anchor podcasting platform. However, there are two catches to this service. First, you have to be both a member of and have a vaulting account with PWCC Marketplace. And two, they do charge a fee for this service. The cost to vault and archive your cards can be found at PWCC's official website, which is www.pwccmarketplace.com/vault-pricing. They have a separate archival fee for graded and ungraded cards, and they also have information related to first-year storage fees as well as long-term storage fees on their website should you choose to keep your cards there longer than a year. The reason why their fees are structured in the way that they are is because their fee structure is geared towards cards that are individually valued at $200 or more per card. If you want more information related to PWCC's Vault, you can check out their FAQ on their website. And that information will also be provided in the description of this video as well as on the Anchor podcasting platform audio. So, we just recently covered the pathway that we took for obtaining an insurance policy geared toward your MTG collection. We also even took a look at an alternative path involving the vaulting of your collection through a one-stop shop like PWCC. But what if neither option is really in your long-term budget? And furthermore, what if you still want to actually play with your collection, such as when you might go to a Command Fest? Well, you still can't really go without some sort of protection. That's just not practical. Therefore, another potentially viable alternative could include getting a safe for your residence and storing your valuable cards there. This assumes that you want to do all of this on the relatively dirt cheap. It's worth mentioning that not all safes are created equal. And in order to get the most bang for your buck, it's important to look at what kind of protection you want to have, whether your emphasis is geared more towards being fireproof or burglar proof, and evaluate that against what type of place you're currently living in as well as where you expect to live in the foreseeable future. Other tertiary conditions can include how many cards you plan on actually storing, how often you plan on accessing your safe, and how you plan on storing the cards in there, whether by just using hard plastic sleeves, putting said cards in binders, or using some sort of other method you've decided on. While the industry standard for fireproof safes are generally geared towards a max internal temperature of 350 degrees Fahrenheit, due to the nature of cardboard and plastic, that may or may not be impractical. This means that getting a safe meant for protecting vital electronic media sources may be a better way to go, and this is because their internal temperature ratings are generally rated to a max internal temperature of anywhere between 72 degrees Fahrenheit and 125 degrees Fahrenheit. However, it's important to consider the trade-offs when buying a safe for your place. Believe it or not, many fireproof safes are not actually burglar-proof. If you live in an area of town where in-home break-ins are common, getting a burglar-proof safe may be a better way to go. Likewise, if you're in a high fire danger area, going with a fireproof safe might be more beneficial to you. Finding safes for sale aren't usually that hard. Most big box home improvement stores have safes for sale that you can buy and install in your home. If you're in an apartment complex or you're renting, however, you'll want to and probably need to get permission from your landlord or property management company before doing anything of that sort. Prices for safes can vary depending on where you get your safe, the location of where you purchase the safe, the size of the safe that you want, and whatever safety features you choose to prioritize. Make sure you do your research. Safes can vary in price anywhere between less than $100 on the low end to a couple thousand or so on the high end. I personally suggest checking out the website Best Consumer Reviews and read up on their reviews for the best fireproof and burglar-proof safes in order to see what each kind of safe is capable of offering to you in terms of home protection. In terms of being fireproof, you'll want to look for safes that either have the sticker UL listed, which is short for Underwriters Laboratories, or that otherwise has a mark of approval from the GSA, which is the Government Service Administration. Finally on the matter, if worse comes to worse and getting a safe isn't practical for your residents, you can always go to a financial institution and get a safety deposit box in the interim until your circumstances change such that they're more favorable to getting insurance on your stuff. With everything out of the way, let's move on to some final thoughts on this topic. If none of the solutions that have been provided are something that's viable for your financial situation, but you still want to protect your cards, an alternative option could include the following. First, get yourself a couple of Ultra Pro brand Pro binders and put nothing but your RL staples in there. This will become your de facto showcase binder and/or high value binder, as we call them around here. Next, legibly record the contents of all of the cards that you intend on storing, whether electronically or in writing, and put a spare copy of the master list with your collection. If possible, have both documents notarized for authenticity. Finally, open up a safety deposit box at your local bank and then store your cards there along with the spare copy of your master list. The good news is that most banks and financial institutions have a notary agent of some kind working at each branch. Additionally, this is probably one of the cheapest paths that you can take to protect your collection, at least in the immediate present, as most safety deposit boxes are fairly inexpensive to get. Bear in mind, however, that there are some drawbacks to going this route. 1. Whatever you store there in your safety deposit box, you're going to also have to go get if you're looking to still play with those cards. And 2, also keep in mind that whatever you add to or remove from your safety deposit box, you're going to also have to manually add it or remove it from your master collection list. Well, that about covers it for this massively in-depth episode of the Tryhard Academy podcast. I hope this guide has been of some help to you as you adventure forward into collecting and protecting your reserved list staples. If you have any experience that you would want to share regarding this topic or a story related to this topic, feel free to share that in the comment section of the YouTube video. As always, if you like this content and want to see or hear more of this content and content like this, feel free to like this video, share this video, and subscribe for future content. Thanks for watching and listening, and as always, it's always better to get good rather than get wrecked.